Hi, my name is Grace Ordonis. My topic is British women writers still having a voice from 1700s to modern day. My main slide is my thesis, and the two main people I wanted to address from my thesis are Mary Wollstonecraft and Elizabeth Montagu, and basically how they became a symbol during their time period that was a driving force against the inequality towards their gender. And that'll probably be concluding my first slide. My second slide, I'll be giving some brief background information on Elizabeth Montagu and Mary Wollstonecraft. So bottom left, Elizabeth Montagu. Elizabeth Montagu was born and raised in Yorkshire, United Kingdom, and died leaving a legacy that still impacts people to this day. Mary Wollstonecraft, on the bottom right, is a philosopher, a poet, and an advocate for women's rights. She was born and died in London, England, excuse me, and she was raised by her abusive father there. So the top right corner is the cool quote, and the cool quote I wanted to discuss is just a quote that I feel like ties in my essay really well. That one was written by Mary Wollstonecraft, and it says, "Taught from infancy that beauty is woman's scepter, the mind shapes itself to the body, and roaming around its gilt cage only seeks to adorn its prison." And that will conclude my second slide. My third slide is about Mary Wollstonecraft, and one of her most famous pieces is Maria, or the Wrongs of Woman, and that was a book that basically discusses women's sexual emotions and that it's perfectly natural and human for women to have sexual urges, and that for men to just grade and just judge women for this is just immoral and not right. Mary Wollstonecraft really just paved a way for literature that went against everything that any other woman had ever done. Before her, no woman had ever discussed women having sexual urges, or the idea of women even having sexual urges, and I feel like that really attributed to women standing up and speaking out more. This leads me to my next slide, which is about Elizabeth Montagu, one of those women. Elizabeth Montagu is also known as Queen of the Blues. She was a writing critic, and her most famous piece was Shakespeare Letters and analyzing Shakespeare. Elizabeth Montagu suffered many tragedies, one of being her first and only child passing in the first year of its life. Her more common literature was her essays or her letters. However impactful these women were during the 17th and 18th century doesn't compare in size to the daily central struggles that these women were forced to live with, while men in suits held their voices, votes, and rights in their loose change pocket. Living in a patriarchal system in which women were generally refused any purpose or voice beside wives or mothers, these women were very rare, and that they were very impactful, and that they didn't just sit there and just listen to everything that a man told them to do, that they stood up for themselves. Going to my next slide, which is the Wollstonecraft legacy. So Mary Shelley Wollstonecraft was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, and Mary Wollstonecraft passed sadly right after giving birth to her, 10 days after. And Mary Shelley Wollstonecraft had a hard childhood growing up. Her father loved her dearly, but her life had become kind of just not very enjoyable. I don't know if anyone had come up with this theory before me, but when I had read her story, I couldn't help but think of how exactly point on point it was to Cinderella. She had a mean stepmother and two mean stepsisters. Her mother didn't even find reason or purpose in putting her through school. She said that her education wasn't important. She didn't really care about her very much, which was kind of funny because she was later on going to find a husband and write Frankenstein, which is world-renowned. It's just a classic known to every person in the world, The idea of Frankenstein came to be when her and her soon-to-be husband were on a vacation with two of their male friends, and her friends were lords. They were joking around with her and said, "Let's make ghost stories." And she made Frankenstein, which is now attributed to many screenplays and remakings everywhere. Which leads me to my next slide, which is history to modern day. So Frankenstein from then to Frankenstein then. Frankenstein then used to be called Prometheus, and he was made after a man named Victor Frankenstein, actually. Maria, or the Wrongs of Woman. Maria, or the Wrongs of Woman was one of the best pieces of writing this whole essay and making it into a project, finding that story. And in the preface, I wanted to read a really quick little excerpt from it because I feel like it's still applicable to today. She says, "I have rather endeavored to portray passions than manners. In many instances, I could have made the incidences more dramatic. Would I have sacrificed my main object, the desire of exhibiting the misery and oppression peculiar to women, that arise out of partial laws and customs of society, in the invention of the story. This view restrained my fancy, and the history ought rather to be considered as of woman than of an individual. Sorry for my poor reading. For Mary Wollstonecraft to write something like that was just very uncommon and extremely rare, considering the specific roles that they had to play as women during their time period. However very rare and few women spoke out against these issues, the majority were expected to fill like a specific role associated to their gender, resulting in the myth that men knew very little of women other than being just objects. Men didn't question this cultural patriarchy created with men laying on top. Women had a hard time escaping these traditional gender roles, leading the way to Renaissance, where women weren't able to create a big revolution, but that paved the way for the Enlightenment, in which women wanted the same educational rights and voting rights and began engaging in higher society. I know this is like a minute over, so I'm just going to keep going because I haven't done this well, and so it's really hard for me to speak. So to conclude, I wanted to say that given these points to summarize, all information is stated above, to ask women to forget or move forward from all injustice brought upon her is simply immoral and corrupt. British women literature in the 17th through 1800s created a voice that exemplifies endurance throughout the chaos of cultural roles. Impactful people such as Mary Wollstonecraft and Elizabeth Montagu used literature to defy social norms and create a future for female authors. Thank you.